in exploring heroes, we have said that everyone, even a hero or a role model, is just a person.
Exactly.
We also are sometimes reminded that everyone is to be seen as a person. So over the last couple of weeks, something very, very interesting has been in the news and posted. Life is always interesting with the different intersections of people and lives meeting, re-meeting. So many years ago, when I worked at the Melton Center at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, I worked with Shira Pasternak Be'eri. She's originally from the States, and she's an editor, a journalist, and a translator. My sister works with her husband, Dr. Eliezer Be'eri, originally from South Africa, Leonard, who is the director of the respiratory rehabilitation department at Aline Hospital. Well, Dr. Be'eri, about 6 months ago, after playing squash, suffered cardiac arrest. He's back at work. Just now, his wife, Shira, has shared something and told us what she did when he was admitted to the hospital. She says her husband, Eliezer, came alone by ambulance from the sports center. He was admitted as a John Doe. Nobody knew who he was. He was unconscious, and Shira felt compelled to make sure that everyone who was about to try to save his life knew who he was. Now, she didn't mean they should know that he was a fellow in cardiology at Harvard or that he had these other degrees. She meant that he was a human being. And what she did was create a sign that she hung by his bed while he was there in the hospital. And above the picture that she posted of him, a beautiful picture, she wrote, "Hello, my name is Eliezer Be'eri. This is what I look like when I am not sedated and ventilated." Underneath the picture, she had a brief CV and words explaining why it was vitally important that Eliezer return to himself. He's a dad, he's a Saba, he's a husband, and he's a doctor. And she writes, he says to us, "My children at home and at the hospital are waiting for me."
Oh.
This sign has been getting such coverage that you read daily another interview with a doctor from different hospitals throughout Israel taking up the idea. See the patient as a person. Now, that idea of seeing a patient as a person is not a new idea, but putting that sign there, and they're getting letters about it. Mostly staff at hospitals have welcomed it. There are some that don't like the message that's being given.
He likes to do it.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with something like this in trucker country. Anybody? It's a wonderful idea.
We're muted.
No?
You just unmuted.
Bracha,
Yes.
in Montreal, in Maimonides, in the old aged home, not necessarily a description, but they had the residents, pictures of them when they were younger. This is what I used to be. You're seeing me like this right now, but this is who I used to be. And I think that that also is
The
so
same
important.
idea.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The memory box is used very often in seniors' homes where, and I know at Baycrest, each room has the memory box outside the room with pictures and memorabilia, tchotchkes even, that were important to that person when they were living in their own home.
And even the pictures of flowers or birds, which was their hobbies.
Uh-huh. Very, very important. Very, very important. Okay.
Fran raised
At
her hand.
2:40, I have
I'm sorry.
an interview with the Alzheimer's Society, an intake interview.
From 2:30.
Fran Kane raised her hand.
Fran, because I don't see all of you.
Okay, so
Please.
when this was the case when Sile was at the Baycrest, he had
Yes.
to go, he had to go to emergency surgery at North York General, and they made sure that a
I'm
family
sorry,
member.
Fran.
Huh?
Fran, just hold on 1 second, please.
Yeah.
Please, if you are not talking to us, please mute yourselves. Thank you. Fran, please go on.
Anyway, the nurses there, well, first of all, they don't like to send them to the hospital, but he had swallowed his ring, and we wanted to make sure we got it out before it went into his lungs. Anyway, you have to have a family member there with an Alzheimer patient, because they can't talk and they can't tell you anything. So you have to be there as their spokesperson and to give all of their information. So that makes them into a person too, it really is.
Yes. Fond memories of Cy.
Yeah.
Okay. So now let's talk about Noah. And I'm about to share my screen. Okay. Text number 1. And Noah also you remembered with love, God, and you came to him with words of salvation, compassion, when you brought on the waters of the great flood to destroy all creatures of flesh, because the practices they followed were corrupt. And so let Noah's memory come to you, Lord our God, that you multiply his children like the dust of the earth, his descendants like the sand of the sea. Is this familiar to anybody? Because I want to ask why we read this. Anybody?
Is that for the prayer for rain during Geshem?
And no, but that's an educated guess.
Yeah, but the prayer of Abraham, God's promise to Abraham, that your children will be as many as the stars in the sky and as the sand in the sea.
But no, but this is a paragraph talking about and calling upon God to remember Noah. Noah. Well, you know, in Rosh Hashanah, in the Musaf, that it is divided into 3 sections.
Mm-hmm.
The Malchuyot, the Zichronot, and the Shofarot.
Right.
And Zichronot have different paragraphs asking for God to remember different points in our history. And we include in the Zichronot verses that remind us how God recalls everything we do. And we recite verses that express how God remembers, in particular, the righteous acts of our ancestors. And we conclude that section with who remembers the covenant. Now, why is this in our machzor? Why, not the zichronot in general, but Noah? And our prayers on Rosh Hashanah, why? Anybody?
Well, that's the first covenant between God and man.
Okay, good. Friends, we are Noah's children, just as we are Adam's children. And by the way, how do we say human being? Ben Adam, a son of Adam. And that was quite intentional, that God created everybody through one person, because originally God was optimistic that everyone would be literally one big family. Michael Rosenak, our author in this, our thinker in this series, reminds us of this. And he tells us that Adam was the first father of mankind, and he was only given one command, and we all know what that was. He was confronted, Adam, with a test of his obedience to God, and he failed. And human behavior continued to deteriorate, and hence the flood. Following the flood, through Noah, the human race was invited into a covenant. So Esther was right on. And the human race was charged with explicit commandments now as an essential condition for their continued existence on earth. And let's remind ourselves of this scene and this breed. And God said to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, and I, behold, I am setting up my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, among the fowl, among the cattle, and among all the beasts of the earth with you, of all those who came out of the ark, of all the living creatures of the earth. Now, I just want to point out, you have a sense here that Noah is just one of the variety of God's creations. Keep that in mind. And I will establish my covenant with you, and never again will all flesh be cut off by the flood waters, and there will never again be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant, which I am placing between me and between you, and between every living soul that is with you for everlasting generations. My rainbow I have placed in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between myself and the earth. And it shall come to pass, when I cause clouds to come upon the earth, that the rainbow will appear in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and between you and between every living creature among all flesh. And the water will no longer become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will see it, to remember the everlasting covenant between God and between every living creature among all flesh, which is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have set up between myself and between all flesh that is on earth. Now,
I think it's
what happens?
I think it's interesting that the rainbow is multicolor, because life is not black and white.
Nice, nice. Okay, another Perush. Now, God has reassessed the human condition. He had a different picture in mind when he first created the Garden of Eden. That's what he expected would remain. But then he sees what happens there, and then he sees the community of Noah, and he understands its propensity for evil. So God becomes, as Rosenak summarizes, realistic, more realistic in his expectations of us. Initially, God did not anticipate a problem with human beings' conduct. Well,
Impossible.
he now realizes that he can't expect that everyone is just naturally going to be good. And he gives Noah these 7 Noahide laws. Now, look at them and then tell me, what is God now expecting? 1, do not profane God's oneness in any way, except that there's one God. ACCEPT. No blasphemy, do not curse your creator. Do not murder. Do not eat a limb of a living animal. Do not steal. Harness and channel the human libido. Establish courts of law and ensure justice in our world. So tell me, looking at these 7, what 2 things is God expecting in general terms of people now?
People should live ethically
Okay, ethically.
and believe in him.
So what's the term for that? Ethical
Monotheism.
monotheism. Okay, Bev knows more than just about truckers and free speech. Right,
I see-
okay?
I see-
God now is expecting at least ethical monotheism, and then he'll be satisfied.
But we
However,
we also see the beginning of the division between relationship between man and man and man and God.
okay, well, that's where the ethics comes in, that he's combining. You need Ben Adam Lamakom, between people and God. And of course, he's not only describing or demanding that you know how to treat other human beings, but he's also being sensitive to animals.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we know, though, that Noah ultimately failed too. He ends his life literally in a drunken stupor, literally. Now, very interestingly, Chazal, our sages, confirm this notion in rabbinic literature that God intended for humankind to live as one unit, as moral beings, and their belief in one creator, one supreme being, would nurture this. I'll repeat that. God was looking for people to be moral people, and he relied on his belief that if they acknowledged him, and that would create humility on their part, that everybody would treat everybody properly. So much so that the rabbis created a midrash on this topic that Rosenak brings us. And it's almost as if they're imagining a Midrashic teacher relates, Alexander the Great visited a certain king in the land of Katzia, an imaginary place, because he wished to see how that king at the ends of the earth, indicating it's really far from reality, dispensed justice. On the particular day of Alexander's visit, two people came before the king to present their dispute for adjudication. One had sold a dunghill to his neighbor. The other had bought it and found a treasure within it. The buyer said, I bought a dunghill, not a treasure, whereas the seller declared, I sold a dunghill and whatever is within it. The king asked one of the two, do you have a son? He answered him, yes. He asked the other one, do you have a daughter? He answered, yes. The king said to him, let them be married to each other and the treasure will be theirs. It's a brilliant solution. Alexander watched the proceedings bemused. When the king of Katzia asked Alexander how he would have judged such a case, Alexander replies, we would have killed both the men and taken the treasure for ourselves. He, the king, asked, Alexander, does it rain in your country? Does the sun shine there? Alexander said, yes. He asked, do you have domesticated goats and sheep in your country? He said, yes. The king of Katzia said to him, may you be blasted. Not by your merit does it rain in your country, or does the sun shine there, but for the sake of the animals, as it is written, man and beast you save, O Lord. You save humans for the sake of the beast. Now, what were the rabbis trying to convey in this beautiful midrash? They were affirming God's initial plan and felt that everyone has the potential without any particular background. But what is needed by everyone is to realize that what we have is because of God. That, the rabbis felt, is universal. Now, getting back to post-Noah. Society like Alexander still did not live as God wanted. And just as God appears to be giving up, God reassesses again. What is going to be God's next move? What do you think before I move the screen? What's going to be God's next move? He's tried this, then a second time, and then Noah fails ultimately.
And then Babel.
If you were God, what would you do after you solve, the Trekker problem? What would you do in this case? I get something, I hang on to it. What does he do?
The 10 Commandments. Like,
Before the 10 Commandments, Linda. Don't skip over somebody.
He's looking for another leader.
oh.
Okay. And who is that leader going to be?
Abraham.
Avraham. Okay. Now, and Abram was 99 years old. That's the way to do it. Live and then be given a new mission in life.
You have to come over and show me a leg, but you know, how to do it,
That's Pearl.
line by line.
Okay, Pearl. And God appeared to Abram and he said to him, I am the Almighty God.
Okay.
Walk before me and be perfect. We won't take the time to compare Avram and Noah, and we've discussed before the difference between walking before and walking with. That already gives Avram more of a qualification to be the leader. And I will place my covenant between me and between you, and I will multiply you very greatly. And Abram fell upon his face, Vayipol Avram al panav, and God spoke with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall become the father of a multitude of nations. And your name shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, Avram to Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Avram is meant to be the father of everyone. Many people think, and there's nothing wrong in thinking that the hey that's added to Avram stands for Hashem, God. But it's really Hamon Goyim,
But
that
there's
he's
also
going
a,
to be a multitude of nations.
there's also a drash that the youth from Sarai was divided equally between the two of them.
Yes. And last week we talked about Sarah, her name being changed from Sarai. And I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings will emerge from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and between you and between your seed after you throughout their generations as an everlasting covenant to be to you for a God and to your seed after you. And I will give you and your seed after you the land of your sojournings, the entire land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be to them for a God. And God said to Abram, and you shall keep my covenant, you and your seed after you throughout the generations. You have a sense that God feels the need to repeat himself. This is my covenant, which you shall observe between me and between you and between your seed after you, that every male among you be circumcised. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be as the sign of a covenant between me and you. And at the age of 8 days, every male, unless he's you, Avram, shall be circumcised to you throughout your generations, one that is born in the house or one that is purchased with money from any foreigner who is not of your seed. And those born in the house and those purchased for money shall be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh as an everlasting covenant. And an uncircumcised male who will not circumcise the flesh of his foreskin, that soul will be cut off from its people. He has broken my covenant. Now, he goes on. And Avram sustains the circumcision. And then we know that God consults with Avram. And the Lord said, shall I conceal from Avram what I am doing when he's about to destroy Sodom? Now, close attention. Abraham will become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations of the world will be blessed in him. Now, as I read the next pasuk, it in part states implicitly what the difference was between Abraham and Noah. So follow. For I have known him, God says about Abraham, because he commands his sons and his household after him that they should keep the way of the Lord to perform righteousness and justice, in order that the Lord bring upon Abraham that which he spoke concerning him. So, what is it that gives Abraham a better chance of succeeding than Noah?
Teaching his kids.
Noah did not pass on his covenant with God to his children. As I said earlier, it's very, very sad, but Noah literally walks around as a drunkard and does not see a mission. He doesn't. But Avram accepts the mission. Now, I want to go back to verse 3.
Excuse me, but isn't that the basis of our Torah, that we have to teach our children? Even the
Absolutely, absolutely. But we would tend to think that that's perhaps a natural quality that a parent would feel universally, that it's my role to teach.
Yeah, but the Torah keep repeating it.
No, when we get to the Torah, of course, Vishinantam levanecha, absolutely. It's vitally essential, vitally. Now, look at verse 3 again. And knowing that I was going to return to it, I said it in Hebrew as well. So he's been told, and he's going to go through this circumcision. And most commentators, when explaining why Avram fell on his face, explain it was due to weakness in anticipating the pain. There is a Rav David Moskovitz, the rabbi of Ashdod, and he explains it differently. But before I share his thought, anybody want to give a psychological reason why at this point Avram feels weak when he's going to go through this circumcision, and not for physical reasons, not for physical reasons. I'm just allowing you to throw out an idea.
Enormous, overwhelming humility.
Okay, that's absolutely a possibility that he's being given this mission. It is, I'm sure it is overwhelming.
When we stand in front of a king, we feel humility, so much more so before God.
In fact,
I'm
anybody
just
else?
thinking, I'm just thinking, the same way, like there was holy ground that he was on because Hashem is talking to him directly. That's also a
Okay, so
possibility.
again, it would be
out of
overwhelming.
Bracha,
Dan.
he could be overwhelmed with this huge responsibility that he's going to have to take on. Am I up to the job? Can I do it?
I would also say gratitude.
Okay, say a little more, Brenda.
I would say gratitude because there's also the promise that he is going to continue and have multiple generations. So the path that he's walking on won't end with him.
Also a possibility.
What
Anyone else?
What about fear?
What kind of fear?
Fear for the responsibility
of everything that is placed at his feet and the necessity to ensure that the nation has what's necessary to learn the laws, to respect.
Okay, all right. I think we can combine all of the answers, that feeling the enormity of the responsibility would, you would hope, create within a person a sense of fear, because otherwise they're going to think too much of themselves and won't succeed. Absolutely. Okay, now listen to what Rav Moskovitz says. You know, Avram is considered our model of hachnasat orchim, hospitality. And it was known, and even if you reread the scene where he has just had his circumcision, you read what's considered the first case of Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick. It says that he's sitting outside his tent, Avram, in the heat of the day. And it's especially poignant because he is recovering. Nonetheless, he's sitting outside, even though it's hot, because he is never going to change his character in watching for strangers on the road in need of hospitality. And the people who were to visit him obviously weren't Jews. And that represents Avraham, this character trait of his. So building on that, Rav Moskovitz says, Avram had been devoted to everyone. And he had in his mind the desire and in his heart to unite humanity around the idea that he focused upon. He envisioned all of mankind joined in a universal bond. So when God then comes along and says, you're going to have to go through these breeds, he understands that to mean that he is now going to be different, and that he's going to have to withdraw and to separate and indeed form a distinct people. And realizing that, he is saddened and overwhelmed and afraid of what's going to happen to universal humankind. I think that is so profound. Here you choose someone, or whether it was Avram that chose God, that is meant to represent in our tradition an openness to everyone, and yet he is the one who's going to reach out. There's that term again, Marlene. That's a reach out through being particular. Now,
Bracha?
yes.
At the same time, when we say the Havdalah every Shabbat, right?
Mhm.
We recognize the fact that we are different. We are like oil. We are separate from the others. We don't, like oil doesn't mix and we don't. Amavdil ben Kodesh lechol ben Israel la'amim.
Okay, so what are you trying to say by that? Just that we're stating that we are.
We accept the nations, but we also respect our separateness. Like you
Okay.
said that Abraham is going to be different. We celebrate our difference.
Okay, now, listen, Esther, carefully. Yes, but it was important for the question that we are about to get to, for us to see how things evolved and what God's original intention was. He did not foresee that there was going to be Canada, United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia. At first, he pictures something very idyllic, but that was when he also didn't realize what giving people free will would lead to. Okay, now we will see that yes, and Rosenak certainly wants us to celebrate our particularism, but he has a burning question. But first, I'd like us to read this short paragraph from Shalom Rosenberg. And I love that on occasion, I get to say that this was somebody that I studied with. I believe he was originally from Argentina or one of those countries. We can understand this notion of chosenness because in fact now with Avram, God does choose one unit. We can understand this notion of chosenness with the aid of a simple parable. Let us imagine a fish who must swim upstream in order to reach the place to lay its eggs. Our fish sees all the other fish swimming in the opposite direction. They swim effortlessly, carried by the current. However, our fish is propelled forward by the imperative of its special mission. What's special? The mission. Allow me to emphasize that we are speaking not of elitism, but of chosenness. A sense of chosenness is necessary to maintain the momentum of any organism which dares to swim against the current.
Beautiful.
A sense of chosenness. I was going to read it again even before you said beautiful. A sense of chosenness is necessary to maintain the momentum of any organism which dares to swim against the current. Now, Bnei Israel, the Israelites, would swim against the current. But what further were they going to carry? What additional covenant were they now ultimately going to carry with them?
Now it will be the 10 Commandments. It would be
Now
the-
we get to Sinai. And Rosenak asks the following. What need is there for the covenant of Sinai? If God thought that morality and belief in him was what the world needed, and he gave the 7 laws of Noah, and that included, we said, ethical monotheism, why Sinai? Doesn't this second specifically Jewish covenant reflect a superfluous and potentially pernicious apartness? That is one of the most perturbing questions of contemporary Jewish life in societies of freedom and basic Noahide morality. I want you to all read that to yourselves again.
Well, I think we have to remember where the people came from. They came from Egypt and surrounded by adultery, by idol worshiping and the different gods. And so now they have a very different task to accomplish.
Okay. Anyone else?
I'm thinking that Hashem wanted it to be visible to a great many people, not just to one person, not just to Abraham and to Abraham's children, but also so it's witnessed by the whole congregation of Israel.
Okay, but what he's doing here is it's not just that moment at Sinai with all of the Israelites, but what he's doing is he's adding on different commandments just for the Israelites and not just the universal laws of Noah.
But they were
And
not
that's a big difference. Now,
not a nation before.
I'm sorry?
We were not a nation before. Now that we are a nation, we have certain rules.
Okay, but everybody's meant to have rules. But what happens here is that there are going to be rules for everyone, and then there are going to be distinct rules. We could say ritualistic rules that is meant for a Jew and not necessarily somebody else. And that doesn't make them a bad person. Now, Rosenak says, in complimenting the king of Katzia, but he says, for all we know, the king of Katzia may have had no vision of the ultimate purpose and significance of human life. Yet he knew that there is a relationship between human morality and the very physical maintenance of human existence. In other words, when the king was wise enough and moral enough to give the response that he did with the seller and the buyer, he was doing that because he was a mensch. He might not have had a need for a vision beyond morality. So what Rosenak is asking, because he's being realistic, he says, fellow educators, fellow parents, first of all, many people and many of our children don't realize that our history begins with Adam. That's not another family. And it's important that we see, for the sake of our lives and the world, that we were all meant to be united. So then you might have a child who's going to ask you, well, if that is the essence of what God wanted, why do we have to add on Sinai? Why do we need the other parts of our covenant? No chametz, build a sukkah, Shabbat. Why do we need these?
To show our uniqueness.
But then he'll answer you and say, you are going to have a child who's going to say, each one of us is meant to be unique. What is this covenant at Sinai telling us which is different than the covenant with Noah and perhaps even Adam. It's as if in God's reassessment, he realizes, I'm not just looking for people to get along. I don't want people to just exist. I want there to be a lofty purpose. Now, I've seen that I sent Adam in his gun, and I sent Noah. That failed. Maybe I have to go about this differently. It's like you have a big organization, and then you want to advertise, or you want to create a major program. What you tend to do is you create a smaller committee to help you sell the idea to everybody else, because God sees it hasn't worked thus far influencing people. And even with Avram, that's not going to be enough. We need a distinct group who is going to understand the message that the laws at Sinai give us, not just rules of how to get along with each other, but also how to enhance and make our lives spiritually meaningful.
But for
And that, Rosenak says, is a challenge. But Rosenak, in this book, one of the chapters is called Children of Two Covenants. We share with the world the 7 laws of Noah, and then we're striving for more, and that striving is eternal. It doesn't mean to say that we have achieved. Now,
Bracha,
yes.
He also raises the question that we always ask, that of it being pernicious, a pernicious apartness, because, yeah, well, you know what that means.
He's being very honest, but he will tell you that as a shomer mitzvot person, that he believes very much in that particularism.
But
don't become fully universal just by being universal. No. Everyone has to come to it with his or her particular being.
But as a Jew, we can't be quite universal. We have to be a group. I'm thinking like of Aaron's vest, you know, there is the 12, and then you have a 2 on the shoulder. Each one of us is like a one shape. That's part of the thing. But it's when we are together that it becomes the essence of Judaism.
Yes. And we will discuss next week the priest's wardrobe. But what Rosenak is pointing out, and we remind ourselves that he is concerned with touching the mind and soul of students. So he's not going to avoid this issue of, well, why are you telling me to feel different? Because Rosenak believes that that is the best way to create a worthy humanity. And it's something that's taken a long time. But each community is meant to do just that.
I'm not sure I
It's
understand.
not enough. It's not enough for us to just think about morality. And I think that David Hartman, Zichrono Livracha, says this beautifully. When he says we're looking to go beyond the ethical. Today, we're just raising this issue because I want you to have an introduction to a great thinker, Michael Rosenak. So he says the following: Judaism, reduced to ethical activism and moral seriousness, without the religious intimacy and mystical dimensions expressed through many of the symbolic ritual mitzvot, would be deprived of much of the richness of the spiritual life. A family seriously committed to the ethical life does not only engage in social and political action. The family enjoys music, art, strolling in the country, intimate family meals and discussions, and the joy of just being together in familial solidarity. It would be a strange family indeed, a rather cold and lifeless family, if the only thing defining its members' familial identity, the only thing they did together, was ethical and political action directed toward making the world a better place to live in. A single-minded vision emphasizing only one aspect of the religious soul's yearning for God undermines the richness that Judaism allows one to appreciate in its integration of the passion of covenantal particularity with concern for the social and political well-being of humankind. I welcome any further thoughts about
I wholly agree with Rav Hartman. I was going to say that Natan fought for human rights,
Yes.
for freedom to speak out and say what you want. And he underwent serious situations and which impinged on his potential life. And yet he always had his book of Tehillim with him all the time. To this day, when he speaks to young people, he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out this weathered book of Tehillim. And he said, there's more to it than demonstrations. There's more
Absolutely.
to it. And there you are. I mean, I understand there's this topic is very interesting and very deep, because there are a lot of Jewish organizations that we know of that feel that if you give charity and you do good in the world, that's it. That's Yiddishkeit. The other part that Hartman's talking about is halakha and a lot of other things that we do. That's not really what we talk about.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Stan. And if I bump into Natan, as I often do, I will pass that on.
Thank
Anyone else?
Actually, I studied because he talked about tzedakah. Reminds me of this week's parasha that talks about half the shekel. And if you take the word machzit, the middle letter is tzadik for tzedakah, touched by chet and yud of chai, and ends by mem and taf, met. So if you give charity, that's a meaning of life. And if you forget about it, there is that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Bracha.
Linda.
I to put it very prosaically and not so intelligently, but the Jews are like, in a way, the canary in the coal mine, because if we are allowed to be whom we are, and then other groups should be allowed to fulfill themselves as to who they are, as long as everybody is under the umbrella of God. But we should be
Nobody
allowed.
is suggesting differently than that.
No. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just
yeah.
using the analogy of, if we can flourish as a canary in the coal mine, then that is a way of seeing that others individually can have their own individuality and particularity, but it's for good.
Amen. Yes, as long as it's for good. You know, when it talks about in the Tanakh about idol worshipers, the biggest issue with that usually is not the fact that they were praying to another god, but because they believed in many gods and were paganistic, it was that the sin was that they were immoral. It's not. You look at the Aleinu. Read the Aleinu. When you daven Shachrit tomorrow, Linda, after the class you were in yesterday, and you see how it ends. You don't see in the Aleinu, on that day it will happen, everybody will recognize God. It talks about morality. It in no way says everybody's going to be Jewish. But we believe that through our particularity, we will reach the Geula. And I would hope that everybody believes that of different groups. And I think there are some who definitely do.
But we are also told not to make God our, a lot of people worship the money, worship God. I think that's a symbol of the golden calf. I'm
not talking about that God. Anyone else?
People, that's a big part of it.
Yes, that's a problem. Marlene.
I think what David Hartman is saying is that we cannot forget, even with our ethical considerations, we cannot forget the joy that we should be getting from our religion. And Rosenak, as an educator, I'm sure worries about the fact that we might forget that joy. What David Hartman is really emphasizing here is that to be able to enjoy Judaism together, and as parents and grandparents and educators, I think this is something that we're trying to put back in to the teaching of Judaism to our children.
Absolutely, Marlene. I think when he describes that image of family solidarity and sitting around the table, one of my fondest memories is sitting around our table on Gemini Road and what was that, Robinter Drive, every Shabbat singing Zmirot. Not because you're told to do it or because you have a chazan in your family, because it brought us joy. I can picture, allow me, taking out the Ramah songbook and going through it, the green and the brown pages. That's a problem, that people see Shabbat do's and don'ts. There's so much more, I believe, every detail. There is some, but every detail is, because anything that's important, you have to look at the details, but they're all meant Oneg Shabbat. You're right, Marlon. The joy of Shabbat. The joy of Shabbat.
Yes.
There's one thing I just wanted to say that what came to mind when you were reading David Hartman was a bit of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because there's also a basic need for shayachut, to be able to feel connected. And I'm not saying that that's the reason, that he was saying it, but it's such a natural need that it's not just to find a way to make people feel connected to Judaism through the Oneg Shabbat or whatever, but there's also a basic need for people to feel connected. And that's what came to my mind when you were reading that as well.
Well, absolutely. That's why the rabbis were great psychologists. And when they said, you should say Kaddish in a minyan, That's not being cruel. That's saying at that particular time, and of course, other times, you need to be surrounded by people. Of course, of course. We all know that we raise our voices that much louder when we are at a rock concert surrounded by people, not when you're sitting in your family room, although you might do that as well. But all of this, all of that is found in what he is saying. And
But when you said Kaddish, remind me, it really comes from the root. To me, Kaddish is connection. I say Kiddush on Shabbat, it's my connection to God. And when a person says Kaddish, it's a connection to the department. So to me,
Yeah.
the word always brings the connection to mind.
absolutely, absolutely.